Welcome to TradeTheNBA.com. This is John. This report is for the 29th, and we talk about October crashes and everything else coming on the 29th and that, but it happened the previous day. None of this is a surprise. We've been looking at a just complete distribution here with long-term, mid-term buyers, barely any activity with short-term buyers. They were able to hold it up for a while, but once we hit the spike of the orange above the cyan seemed to trigger it all. And mostly we were really looking at the NASDAQ because it was the NASDAQ's break of the 50% that we were really most interested in, because that was going to be the catalyst that would drive things lower. And of course we hit the 23 already on the NASDAQ and fighting right in between right at this particular point. So Power Mode 2 crossover in the declining direction and everything all spot on with that. It was much clearer even on the S&P and still below the red line. So all that being said, we can skip the euro, no change. Gold's not going to do anything as well. Everything's going to be based on the election. But I thought we'd get into some of the little minutiae here. This is a 5K chart with a bunch of little dots. So this goes back to Wednesday's, well, actually Tuesday late evening, where we got our first short signal, and we started into the day of Wednesday, yesterday, and started to continue the fade. And then we ended up with, and these are kind of the little situations I'd like to talk about, because this is what you've been seeing me work with here on the long short algo. And let me get rid of the Morganacci lines, and you'll be able to see them much clearer. So we had the long algo test here, which adjusts the values based on Morganacci lines, going away from their true values. But in looking at it, what we find is that when we get long signals that have been in a no DOC steel reset, meaning that steel has not dipped back below red, you find a continuation pattern in the direction of the long and short algo. And so where there's no plateau in that, in the long and the short algo, when we get these signals, they tend to not be successful from a buy configuration, even though they meet all the criteria of orange dip, even sometimes on a P2, potentially even can get green close to the cyan, but it isn't enough to sustain it. And that's exactly what we saw with this. And I wanted to start pointing out the important relationship between this green crossover when we do have those signals, and how that, while a buy, and let me go ahead and enlarge this a little bit just so you can get a better idea, because there was so much range in the day. It looks so strange to me without the Morganacci. I want to put those back on real quick. Okay, put the Morganacci back. Actually, these are way too big here. Let's just get us a little more chart range, make it easier to see. Okay, so in essence, though, this is a buy, even though what happens to it is you end up with this setup that takes place right over here by this dotted line. And what I was pointing out is you get the steel crossover below the cyan and then orange above it, and that's usually the catalyst trigger when you're in these runs of no steel reset. We can equivalently say that it gave a reset when we move above the 13.5, which is usually the only place that I like those buy configurations that don't have a reset, because by moving above there, you've literally come from underneath. And then oftentimes what you'll get is this slow cascade coming back down, which normally we would consider negative, but once it's triggered above there, actually has a net positive effect, which you can see clearly as we rose fairly nicely, but do a declining Morganacci lines, which brought us up to 38% before giving that sell trigger. Now, the inverse is true when it comes around. If you have an improvement either in both the long algo, and in this case you had still continuing decline DOC, as well as the Power Mode 2 direction lower with the crossover for the short signal. So no surprise there. But as we moved across in time, people always said to me, wow, I think I missed the run. There's no way to get back into it. Well, this kind of gives you that clear definition here. Again, this is that steel crossing below, orange moving above, and triggers it again at that particular point. And you're thinking, my God, we just made a new low and it's triggering further lows. Yeah, well, and you could potentially have this as a buy turnaround, which can happen immediately after that setup, except for, again, the fact that we have, and we'll probably see this again in a different configuration where you have the long algo pointing higher, and this short signal doesn't have the same effect, and I'll show you that one in a second, because it becomes critical as it's a reflection of the momentum within this setup. So, I mean, you can see how long this no DOC steel reset took place. We did not dip down at all, going back through and below. Actually, this could have even been marked right here as a buy if it wasn't such a nice continuation downturn. I should mark it just to have it in there, because that's what I do look for, is that generic crossover that has the green moving above cyan above the 13.5. Again, did not last very long and produces exactly this same configuration. So there was no surprise with that. The only thing I don't like about this configuration is we were still in a declining short algo. The long algo looked like it had just flattened up. The short algo was in a continuation decline. So it's relevant to point out so that you can see how these interactions take place, and they're really relevant in the overall description of how price moves. And here again, same crossover. This time the orange doesn't cross above cyan, and that gentle weakness makes it for a softer signal. So it's worth pointing out that you can gauge a bit of the intensity of these. When we get the strong move crossover, where it really spikes above, you tend to get, like right here, where this closed down. Actually, place right there where all of them cross. So the orange is above, steel cross below. And interestingly enough, you have cyan over 0, which is another element that I was testing. And then it doesn't take but much for that to just fade and roll right back down to the 0 configuration again. Likewise, we end up with the dotted line configuration, because you had the buy setup that took place right there. It's marked with the dotted green instead of with my vertical. So the red dotted one here, interesting setup. So we had a cyan under red, always buy, flips up for the 1 bar going above, orange spikes, steel dips below. You would think you have everything going in that way, but notice your long short algo pointing straight up. And in fact, that's exactly what price continues to do until we do hit a DOC spread right here. And you'll notice how long short algo has flattened at that particular stage, and that becomes relevant. My feeling too is on a DOC spread, if you've got a positive extreme anywhere in between there, fine to go ahead and take, because it also gives you a pretty clear clue as to what the retrace values were. In this case, it was bringing it all the way back down to the 3286 range from 96. So full 10-point projection on that one, and it did far better than that. And then as we're coming down, you'll notice we ended up with this earlier one, again, the orange configuration setup, but problematic is right after the signal bar, before we get the green crossover, this is always a tough one, I've got dip below the red line. So this is one of those where I'm typically, when I see the signal, I'm looking for some kind of discount. But better than even taking the play to the long side is recognizing the long short algo and continue to decline. And so you're going to find in the update for the coming month, these won't even show up. It won't be until right over here where you have the turnaround play, and your signal bar, coming up right through here where you've already got the power mode 2 cross, you already had the dip of the orange in that. You get confirmation 1 bar later with the green over cyan, which literally happens at the open of the bar, so it's not hard to just click at that particular point, and then you have your turnaround with the upside potential move. And of course, you can look at these individual little constructs right here. But again, you can see that these are taking place under the rising algo. When it does start to flatten out, certainly there's a greater propensity, but in this case, we didn't really get any negative signal for this setup other than what was already a DOC spread, and then just the green crossing below red was enough to give that the dip downward. But just from the earlier configuration, it wouldn't be enough to trade you out of that because you still hadn't violated your zero or anything like that. But then you get kind of, that muck, and it's a general bias upward though with the long and the short algo. And that's important to recognize when you're looking at this from a flip of direction. When we came up to here, again, positive extreme right there, happening just before the full candle setup. So, this is one of those where, I'm looking at the DOC spread that took place, the bar earlier, and I'm saying to myself, okay, I'm going to go ahead and, jump in on that. And it's a good one because I'm between the 76 and 100%, which I kind of like, because then you can be somewhere up there and it makes it easier from an overall stop value point. And you kind of realize that when you've had this first run, we're not above the 15, something, well, maybe I'm going to get a retrace back to at least the 50%, maybe a little bit more. Simply because it may not, be a continuation run. We won't be able to tell that until we see a breakdown. And in this particular case, you do get 4 or 5 bars sideways movement. That happens a lot in these initial ones. And oftentimes, even within those, you might then see the reverberation change right here, where you'll get that steel crosses above cyan and orange dips below, usually followed though by green crossing the red. And I think in this particular case that doesn't take place, which is part of that shakedown breakdown that you're getting right here, where you're dropping into the negative territory, and that was enough to just completely collapse it. And then of course, following the long short algo, continuation decline, you'll see, then it begins to flatten out, and that's usually where we get our first initial early signal, is right at this beginning flatness. And if I can bring these up, you can see where I have the 4 algo levels, the red and magenta. Well, when we're looking at the short algos, if you're looking at the magenta and you're looking at the red and white are the original ones that are adjusted to it. The natural form are these magenta and the blue. It just makes it easier to say it that way. When we look at the numbers, though, you can start to follow how right here, 66, and it just maintains itself. So after, and I'm only looking for a couple of bars, but the short algo, 74.50, 25, and then it holds at 74, but dips to 73. And then it's not until it holds at 73, and then you see, of course, my green dotted line, which turns out to be the turnaround. I just moved the solid line over 1 just to be able to see that's how it's capturing it, and recognizing that change. And of course, that led to new highs before the DOC spread, which has left us in a turnaround where the algo's just kind of gone flat. And in this particular case, that's where I usually look for, we will call this a rising 3 methods, where pops back up. But to me, it's just the long algo and them working out their final softening as they're able to offload and prepare for the next move. In this case, appears to be negative. I think I took that short. I didn't get the best of entries. 92 and a quarter. Yeah, so literally right down in here. It was right in the middle of that, so nothing spectacular. But again, you don't have to be perfect on that one. I saw it later and just hopped onto it. So that's the difference on how that can work out. All things being equal, looking at it just the right way here, with the orange pop above, cyan rising, steel drops below, green below, that should break to 50% at this particular stage. We'll see how that plays out. As always, though, I will post more details on the Skype chat. Sorry I went long on this, but some interesting and powerful things to look at. Trade well.